didn't miss that, but I'm glad you had a good time. Before we get started, back into the material we were working on, one of the folks in the group caught me at lunch today, and or breakfast, I forget which one it was, made reference to a comment that I was just able to get hold of. I spent most of the afternoon trying to download graphics and stuff, and satellite internet is not quite as fast as what I've got at home, let's just put it that way. And barely got this down this afternoon in time to play it for you. But in fact, I'm going to speed it up just a little bit, just like I do on the dividing line. But little comment toward the end of the most recent Reasonable Faith podcast from William Lane Craig. And while I was working on the presentation today, I was listening to a 2.5-hour edition of Unbelievable with Sean McDowell, who is Josh McDowell's son, in dialogue with this guy I'd heard about. All the stories said Christian minister spends year as an atheist and becomes an atheist as a result. And so he was dialoguing with that guy. Well, the guy was a Seventh-day Adventist, and I have some serious problems with Seventh-day Adventist theology, and could explain to you the investigative judgment and stuff if we had the time to get into that kind of thing. But it is a classic example of what's becoming much, much more clear and obvious, the difference between a minimalist and an apostolic approach to truth and the proclamation of the gospel. And it's a fascinating contrast to see. But one of the primary progenitors of that movement is Dr. Craig. And so he's answering some questions about evil and stuff. And Dr. Craig is a Molinist. And Molinism is the theory of middle knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into a lot of detail on that right now, but I did want to play a section of his response. It's fairly short, just as an example of, from my perspective, what happens when you combine minimalism with a hyper-focus upon philosophy. And when I say hyper-focus, someone could testify, but is not in the room at the moment, of having heard Dr. Craig at a conference after speaking, saying to a number of young men around him that if you want to truly do good apologetics, you need to stop reading so much theology and start reading more philosophy. And so that's what I mean as far as the balance is concerned. Well, I'll let you judge as to the balance of these comments that are made, but here's from the most recent Reasonable Faith podcast.
So that would do it for the atheist if he could prove either a contradiction in the concept of God, which I've worked on, to have a coherent view of theism, or if he could show that the evil in the world made it impossible or improbable that God exists. That would falsify theism. But you're not going to falsify theism by pointing to Bible difficulties or the theory of evolution and things of that sort. That just goes no distance to showing God does not exist.
I just point out, just notice, I sense a rather dismissive air in Dr. Craig's voice. You're not going to disprove God's existence by talking about Bible difficulties or stuff like that. Idea of revelation. Let's not worry about that. That's an interesting approach, to be sure.
I get the feeling that Brian would like to ask about 15 more questions, but he asks one more here. If God can create a world where the maximum number of free creatures come to him by choice, by having evil in the world, why couldn't he create a world where that same maximum number came to him freely without evil? You may say he can't force us to freely do something. But if he knows ahead of time and creates the circumstances for which we will come to him, in what way is he not responsible?
To the question?
Okay, now, I almost have to explain what Molinism is, and that would be the rest of the evening.
Yeah.
It really would be, and you'd still be sitting there going, huh? And it might actually work better if we get the sommelier to come down. That would help us out to understand a lot better. But fundamentally, what Dr. Craig says is, his viewpoint is that God, through middle knowledge, is able to examine all possible worlds and to actualize the one world in which the maximum number of people are saved in relationship to the maximum amount of good. And so God's this huge computer program, and he is able to, on the basis of middle knowledge, which is a knowledge of what any free creature would do given any certain circumstances. So if there is free creature X in this world under these circumstances, he do these things. In another world under these different circumstances, surrounded by different people, he do these things, etc., etc., etc. And God doesn't determine the character or the nature of any of those free creatures. Who determines that? Nobody knows. That's the big issue in Molinism, is free creature X will only do what free creature X will do, and God did not determine that. God has nothing to do with that. He can only deal with the cards he's been dealt. It's how he's actually expressed it. So I keep saying, we need to find out who the card dealer is, because that's the guy in charge, not the God you're talking about. But his idea is evil has to exist because of all the worlds that God examined, this was the best he could do. What we've got is the best that God can come up with. To get the number of redeemed people and the amount of good he wanted, you had to have the amount of evil that we have here. This is just the best. It's the best possible world there was. There wasn't anything better. And so the question the guy is asking is based upon that particular concept.
In what way is he not responsible?
The answer to the question is that it may not be feasible for God to create such a world. What people often don't understand is that you can't just sort of pluck out of this possible world those who freely come to Christ and put them in a world of their own and leave out all those who reject Christ. Because you see, once you do that, you've got a new possible world. And in that world, that same group of people might not come freely to know Christ.
Are you following this? So in this possible world, X number of people will freely come to know Christ because they've been put into a position by God where that's what they will do. But if you take them out of this world, put them into another world with different people, then they might not freely come to know Christ. So you can't just pluck them out and drop them in someplace else, because then maybe they wouldn't come to know Christ. And God has no control over any of this stuff, because middle knowledge determines what he can and cannot do, and it's derived outside of himself. We don't know where it comes from. It's a great mystery. We don't know. But he's constrained by these things. And so that's why he says it's not feasible. It's not feasible for God to have created another world, because if you pull the people that accept Christ out of this world, they might not accept Christ in another world.
It may be that some of them only come to know Christ freely in the actual world because of certain things that happen in the actual world related to evil or others rejecting Christ or something of that sort. So the point is that it's impossible to just pluck these saved people out of this world, stick them in a world of their own, and expect everything to remain the same. That's not the way it works. And so there simply may not be the circumstances available to God in order to create a world of universal salvation.
Did you catch that? Let me play it again. Make sure you hear what's being said.
There simply may not be the circumstances available to God.
Circumstances available to God. So again, all God can do is examine. He's given these circumstances, and he is constrained by what these circumstances are, and this is just the best he can do. And those circumstances are determined by somebody else. And I keep pointing out to my mollusk friends, and who determined these circumstances? Who determined what free creatures would do in certain, and they said, well, that's just an improper question. I just go, is this really sound like the God of the prophets? Is this the God of Isaiah? Is this the God of Daniel 4? Doesn't sound like it to me.
In order to create a world of universal salvation that doesn't have other overriding demerits. For example, maybe God could create a world of universal salvation that has only two people in it, that only exist for 2 minutes, and then they die. Well, right, maybe in that world God achieves universal salvation. But he couldn't achieve a world involving this much good as in the actual world, but without also this many people freely rejecting him in his every effort to save them. That just might not be feasible for God, given the nature of creaturely freedom.
There is the key. There is the overriding, controlling factor in William Lane Craig's entire theology. Let's hear it again.
To save them. That just might not be feasible for God, given the nature of creaturely freedom.
So, what is feasible for God is determined ultimately by creaturely freedom. So, and this is even before God decrees to create. Creaturely freedom constrains the choices God can make even before He creates. It is an amazing thing, and Dr. Craig well knows that he has a standing challenge from me to debate the subject of Molinism, and that will happen sometime when you can sunbathe on the beach in Juneau in January. So, yes, sir.
Is there a control knob for the microphone?
A
behind
control
you?
knob for the
Can you
microphone.
turn it up just a little bit? We're competing with other sound tonight.
Well, I guess.
That's much better.
Okay.
Thank
you. Okay, so shifting gears. I just listened to that this afternoon. Went, oh my! You'll probably hear it again next week on the Dividing Line. Even though we just broadcast it on Facebook, but not everyone's tuning into the Facebook feed. We're still seeing a few whiners talking about the Dividing Line.
If they're on Twitter, they don't matter.
Yeah. Well, okay. Oh. Oh. Okay. Everybody on Twitter does not matter. That was a quote directly from Rich Pierce. And his email address is. And, we'll go from there. Actually,
They know how I feel about that.
They do. Okay. We were talking about the text of the New Testament. We looked at Bart Ehrman. We listened a little bit to Shabir Ali. In our last time together, we've seen how scholars spin the evidence, particularly in media appearances. They emphasize that all we have are copies of copies of copies of copies from hundreds of years after the originals. And so this is meant to inculcate in the minds of their listeners the idea that the New Testament text is particularly liable to error in its transmission. What they don't say is that this is true of every work of antiquity, and that in reality, when it comes to the New Testament, we have the most widely and earliest attested of all ancient documents that come to us from antiquity is the New Testament. So if all these things make the New Testament unreliable, then what that means is every ancient document is even less reliable. Now, people like Ehrman will go ahead and admit that when forced to do so, but he is rarely forced to do so. And so the question comes up, and many of you already know the answer to this question, so if you've already listened to this before, please don't ruin it for everybody else. But when you consider the fact that there are just under 6,000, but last number I heard was 5,717. The number keeps changing each year for various reasons, not just because of the discovery of new manuscripts, but discovering that one manuscript that had a number over here is actually part of a manuscript that's on another continent someplace, and so they have to combine the two together so the number goes down, or you start photographing a manuscript and discover that in reality it's made up of two manuscripts, and so the number goes back up again, so the number keeps changing each year. But there are 5,717 cataloged manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, most of the older ones, most of those that are younger, so say after 1000 AD, will be of the entire New Testament. Most of those beforehand are not of the entire New Testament. Those in antiquity, the oldest ones, will be fragmentary. But when you look at that 5,717 manuscripts in handwritten form, how many variants would one expect to have when you compare these together? Now, when I say a variant, I mean any change in spelling, word order, whether a verse is one place or someplace else, wherever there is a variation in the actual text itself, that counts as a variant. And unfortunately, you may have read some rather popular books that have a misapprehension on this particular issue. I was even taught this by some people, at the same time I was taught the truth by others, but a little confusing there for a while. But there are some who have said, well, the reason that there's a large number of variants is because if you have a variant in 10 manuscripts over against 30 manuscripts, then that's actually a total of 40 variants. And that's not the case. A variant is simply any disruption in the text, any difference in the text, doesn't matter how many manuscripts it's in. It's actual changes or alterations or some difference between handwritten manuscripts. Now, in thinking of that number, think what would happen if we had the time in this room to take. What we'd do is we would take Samuel's notebook from him, and we would have everybody on the front row attempt to copy Samuel's notes, just 3 pages of Samuel's notes. Now you're looking over at Samuel's notes, there, right? Can you read them? No, it is not possible. So he's writing in Arabic, Sanskrit, what is it? Iowan German, something like that. It's hard to say. Okay, pretty tough to read. Huh? Okay, all right. Well, maybe someone else. Okay, over here. Now, are those legible? That they're legible. Okay, we're going to have to forget about Samuel. Samuel has been kicked out of the ancient church scribal society for the creation of way too many textual variants due to bad penmanship. Bad Samuel. Okay, and so we move over here and we have a legible copy of the original. And so we have everybody on the first row copies that, and then their copy is passed to the next row behind, and then you copy theirs, you keep yours, and you give your copy to the next row, and then back to the back row, and they make a copy. And then what we do is we take only the back row's copies, and we compare them with one another. What's going to have happened in the process of the transmission of that text? Even that might take us a couple hours to do. And I've always wanted to do that, never had really the time to do it. It'd be fun to do, though. What's going to happen in that process is everyone in the back row, it's 3 pages, is everyone in the back row going to hand us a copy that is going to be identical to the original up here? No. Will some be closer than others? But let's say on the back row that we have certain people who are excellent copyists, and then other people who are not excellent copyists, okay? The quality of the excellent copyists' final copies back here is not just determined by their skill, because they're only copying what's been given to them by the people in front of them. And this guy here is clearly not a great copyist. The original was notes on textual criticism. When it went through this guy, it became something about the Dallas Cowboys. So you really have a problem along the way. So you see, you can have really good copyists, but they can only deal with what they have. Now, we could then make it even more real by letting people in the third row have not only the copy from the person in front of them, but a copy from someone in the first row. Now they have 2. But what are they going to do when there's a difference between the 2? And they can't ask the people before them. They have to judge solely, and they don't know where it came from. So they can't look at the person and go, oh, it came from that guy, so I'm not going to trust that one, I'm going to trust this one. You can't tell. And so now the copyist themselves has to engage in what? Textual criticism. They're having to, if they've got 2 manuscripts and there's differences between them, what are they going to do? And what if one says one thing and one uses like a synonym? What do you do then? So there's all sorts of issues that immediately begin to suggest themselves to us that used to be more understandable to my audiences than they are today. You know why? Because we don't copy anything. We cut and paste. You copy a block of text and you dump it into the word processor, and that's it. Now, some of you are old enough to remember how we used to do term papers. I wrote my college term papers, well, up until a certain point. Then we got our first computer, a compact portable. It weighed about 45 pounds. size of a Singer sewing machine. And you can start doing things like copy and paste and stuff like that. But vast majority of my education, you propped a book open next to you, and you came up with all sorts of innovative ways of holding that thing open. And you sat there and you did this. You copied it into your IBM Selectric. Remember the IBM Selectric? Wasn't that a beautiful machine? Oh man, I remember when we took a leap forward in technology when we bought our first IBM Selectric Greek ball, where you could actually take the English ball off and put the Greek ball on and go, Greek, oh yes, oh I misspelled it, oh man, and then you get the whiteout out and the correction tape, and oh, it's just, it took forever, but anyway, those are the good old days, and you made errors when you copied from a printed book, going back and forth, even while typing. Whether you were writing, whether you were typing, as long as your eyes are going back and forth, your eyes have to go back to the original and find where you were and not be on the line before or the line after, etc., etc. And so it used to be easier to explain the process of the appearance of copyist errors than it is today. Because of the advancement of technology and the utilization of the copy, cut and paste type technology that we have today. Well, with all that said, how many variants do we have in what's called the manuscript tradition, which is all the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament? Well, I frequently ask that question, but I'm afraid that this audience is far too advanced to even bother asking people to make guesses, because the vast majority of you already know the answer to this. Those of you who do not, just go ahead and go, and then you'll look really smart and like you were up to speed with everybody else and stuff like that. But there are approximately, and this is agreed to by conservative scholars as well, there's about 400,000 variants in those manuscripts. And there are 138,213 words in the New Testament. Now, how did we come up with that? Well, I took the Nestle-Aland 28th edition Greek New Testament today, and I verified this number. I did a search for star under words, and came up with 138,213. That's how you count how many words there are. It's a whole lot faster than it used to be in the olden days. I could just see some poor Greek class about 50 years ago when some professor decided, I need to know exactly how many words there are in the printed Greek New Testament, so we're going to spend the whole semester doing just that. And you've got Matthew, you've got Mark, that's sort of how they did things. Now we do it very, very quickly. 138,213 words in Nestle-Aland 28th edition. That's nearly 3 variants per word, and so we are adamantly told no one can have any confidence that the text they read today accurately reflects what was originally written. In fact, if you put it into a graphic mode, here you would have the number of words in the New Testament in blue and the number of variants in red. And so your Muslim friends are talking about how you've got 3 different choices for every single word, and they really think that that's the case. They've not actually looked into it themselves. But that's what they think, and as long as it sounds good and you can silence the Christians with it, that sounds great. But let's talk about what they don't tell you. What they don't tell you is that 99% of all variants do not impact the meaning of the text. Variations in spelling and word order make up the vast bulk of the variations. In other words, 99% of the variants you could not explain to someone who doesn't read the original language, because it doesn't translate out of the original language. For example, when I took Greek, there was this interesting phenomenon known as the movable nu, and that wasn't so long ago. That was some development in Greek, as it was a living language. The movable nu is very similar to what we have in English. Where you're supposed to say an apple, an abacus. You're supposed to put an N after A before pronouncing a vowel. And they had the same thing in Greek. And so this strange letter nu would appear in the manuscript on a word that normally would not have it, simply for pronunciation's sake. And scribes really struggled with this. And thousands of those variants are just whether the nu is there or not. It doesn't have a thing to do with the meaning. It's just whether the scribe understood that rule and the utilization of it or something like that. It does not translate out of that. 99% of them simply do not make any difference at all. So 1% of 400,000 is about 4,000 meaningful textual variants out of 138,213 words is 2.9%, or one meaningful variant every 3 pages. But only half of these are viable. Now, what does viable mean? Well, a variant that appears in a 13th century manuscript, that appears in no manuscript before it, it appears in no translations, because remember, you're not just talking about Greek manuscripts here when you're talking about textual criticism. We also look very carefully at the Latin, at the Sahidic, Bohairic, Coptic, all sorts of early translations of the New Testament. And if a variant has never been seen before, there's no evidence of it in any other translation, there's no evidence of it in preceding Greek manuscripts, comes from the 13th century, then in all probability, that scribe had a bad day that day, and that is not a viable variant. In other words, it could not be the original. It has left no history to itself. It could not go back to the original itself. And so only about half of those 4,000 meaningful textual variants, in other words, that actually impact the meaning of the text, only about half of these are viable. So there are about 1,500 to 2,000 viable, meaningful New Testament textual variants. That is quite a different picture than what we had before. So you think of that graphic where we had the blue line and the red line. Now you take a look at it, and the blue line is the number of words, and there's the number of actual meaningful, viable variants down there at the bottom. Very, very different situation than what is normally presented, especially by Bart Ehrman clones and people like that. Even though Bart Ehrman would agree with this. He might say 98% or something like that, but fundamentally he would agree with this. And so, but he doesn't care, to be perfectly honest with you, whether people misuse his material to destroy the faith of Christians or not. That's something else that we can talk about. Now, a simple fact, think about it with me. The more manuscripts you have for a particular work, the more textual variants you will have. If we have, if all we have is Codex Samuelensis, as difficult as it is to read, how many textual variants are there if all we have is one manuscript of Codex Samuelensis?
0.
None. But that one manuscript better be the right one, because if you only have one, you have no way of comparing to see if anything has been lost, missed, or anything else. And so if you only have one manuscript, you have 0 textual variants. As soon as you have 2 manuscripts, you will have textual variants, but you now have twice as much evidence for the text. And if you have 100 manuscripts, you'll have more textual variants, but you have 100 times the evidence for the original text. And so most ancient critical scholars look at those of us that work in the New Testament and go, what are you people complaining about? We have an embarrassment of riches. There is no other work of antiquity that comes even close. The problem almost is we have too much evidence. They very frequently have to put back together the works of Plato on the basis of less than a dozen manuscripts, the earliest of which was written 900 years after the original. So they've got huge problems to deal with, and we're arguing over a single phrase or a single word or something like that here, there, everywhere. So there's just a huge, huge difference. So when you think about it, there, as we said, more than 5,700 cataloged manuscripts of New Testament books, the average of which is 350 pages long. So that is over 2 million pages of handwritten text, grand total. So think about what that means. 1,500 to 2,000 meaningful and viable variants, over 2 million pages of hand-copied text spanning approximately 1,500 years, pretty much prior to the invention of printing, is an amazingly small percentage of the text, reflecting an amazingly accurate history of transmission. One might say it is downright miraculous. Now, that's not what you're going to hear in most of your university classrooms. That's not what you're going to hear at your community college. But that's the fact. And unfortunately, the vast majority of those community college professors and university professors don't know the difference either. They've not heard the story accurately or done their own research to find out. A number of years ago, I asked my Bible program that this was actually back when I was still in Windows, so this was BibleWorks that did this, but BibleWorks, Logos, Accordance, they all have the same modules and capacities to do stuff like this. But I asked my computer to compare the two most dissimilar printed editions of the Greek New Testament. And those would represent, we'll talk about these a little bit later, but the Alexandrian text on the one side, the Byzantine text on the other. And so this is a comparison of the two ends of the spectrum as far as readings in the New Testament are concerned. And the differences are marked in green. So you can see, looking at the screen there, that here in Ephesians chapter 1, the vast majority of the text is absolutely certain. There's no variation whatsoever in the printed editions of these Greek New Testaments. In the few places where we do have something, for example here, in the heavenly places en Christo, you have the preposition is a variant, but those of you who can read Greek know that whether it said tois aperinios Christo or en Christo is not going to actually affect the meaning because the Christo automatically gives the case ending already, so you know how to translate it. In him, right here, is a variant, but there's one you can barely see, which is one of the significant textual variants in the New Testament. You can barely see it, it's right here. Sorry about that. One letter word, ha estin arabon, at the beginning of verse 14, is referring to the Holy Spirit. And pneuma in Greek is a neuter. And so has, he, ha are the forms, masculine and feminine neuter forms. And so ha is the neuter. It would match spirit, so that there would be a matching that's going on here. But some of the manuscripts say has, which would be the masculine, which interpretationally wise would contain an emphasis upon the personality of the Spirit. And in the Gospel of John, the masculine pronoun is used in the Spirit. So there is that variant that is found there. But the point being, when you look at this, very, very little difference between them. Certainly not the idea that you have three options for every single word, though you will hear people out there telling others that that's the case. It's not the case. But how many Christians do you know that it's not the case? Not very many at all. Not very many at all. This needs to be general knowledge amongst our people. It really does. Now, I already mentioned to you once what book of the New Testament has the smallest manuscript attestation. Book of Revelation. And so it shouldn't surprise us too much when we look at Revelation 1:1. There's a little more variation found in that. In fact, the textual basis of Revelation is by far the most difficult and interesting of any book in the New Testament. It really, really is. There are some of the toughest variations to figure out are found in the book of Revelation. No two ways about that at all. But now theorize, what would be the New Testament book that has the fewest variants? It's sort of hard to, what would cause a book to have variants or not have variants, and it's sort of hard to answer, but I'll just graphically illustrate it for you here. It's the book of Hebrews. And you almost have to look hard. We've got one here, and we've got one down here, and one here, and that's it. There's only 3 extremely minor variants in all of Hebrews 6, 8 through 20. Everything else, just no question about what the original text was, what it means, what it said, nothing. Very, very clear, very strong. But we still have to understand, even the 1500 to 2000 number needs to be understood. Even when the variant does impact the reading, in the large majority of instances, the careful student of the text can see which reading is the original. Many of these errors involve common scribal errors, mistakes we continue to make this very day when copying from one text to another, unless we are using editing functions in doing so, I guess. Here is an important example from the history of the New Testament itself. 1 John chapter 3, verse 1, in the King James Version says, "Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not." Now compare that with the New American Standard, and it says, "See how great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we would be called children of God, and such we are. For this reason, the world does not know us, because it did not know him." Now, for the gentlemen in the audience who are colorblind, and there normally are gentlemen in the audience who are colorblind, the phrase, "and such we are," is in red. And you will see it is not found right there in the King James translation, or the New King James translation of the Bible. Now, this is a textual variant. This has nothing to do with the prejudices of the Anglican translators of the King James or anything like that at all. The reason there's a difference is because the Greek text that the King James translators translated, which is called today the Textus Receptus, does not contain the phrase. And the modern Nestle-Aland text, United Bible Society text, does contain the phrase. Well, why? Why is there a difference? Well, this is a glowing example of what is called homoi teleuton. Now, if you really want, if tomorrow morning at breakfast you're sitting down with some folks up at the breakfast thing, if you really want to get their day started off right, start off the discussion of homoi teleuton, and you'll discover that you'll be eating alone very quickly. Because they will all of a sudden have the sudden need to get some more fried fish from the back of the ship or something. But homoi teleuton means similar endings. Similar endings. Think how many times, again, this was more relevant to us older folks than the younger folks, but think how many times you have been copying a word ending with such combinations as ing, tion, es, and when looking back at what you are copying, have mistakenly started with a different word that had the same ending. And so very often we can tell, in fact, you can pretty much tell when you're looking at a manuscript that was copied by sight. So in other words, you had an exemplar and the scribe was copying by sight from another manuscript. What was the other way that manuscripts could be produced in the ancient world? You had a scriptorium by someone dictating it. So you'd have someone standing up front, and you'd have 2 or 3 or maybe even 10 scribes if it was extremely important, and you'd have someone reading. And when there was a question, a scribe would raise their hand. Was that a singular? Was that a plural? And then you'd have a proofreading that would go on. But we can tell by looking at a manuscript which one it was. Or even in some manuscripts, some is done from a manuscript and some is done by dictation. But certain words in the ancient Greek language are pronounced very, very similar to one another and would both make sense. There are a number of variants in 1 John chapter 1, whether it's our joy or your joy. And the reason being that ours and yours were pronounced almost identically to one another. If you weren't really paying attention, didn't stop and say which one is it or whatever else, it would be very easy to confuse the two. And so homoteleuton is only relevant as an error of sight, not an error of hearing. But it happens a lot in the New Testament. So here is Greek New Testament, and you have 1 John 3:1. See what great love has been given to us by the Father, in order that children of God we might be called, and we are. Diatuta hakasmos uganoskai hemas. For this reason the world does not know us, because it did not know him. So here is the phrase, kai esmen. You'll see a little square next to it right here, and then a little backslash right here. That's indicating these two words are not found in part of the tradition. You find a little square down here, and it is deleted by KL04969, the Fraktur letter M, and certain manuscripts of the Vulgate. What you need to understand is that, notice how frequent that Fraktur letter M is. It's found there, it's found there, it's found there. That's a rather important little thing, because that means the majority text. That means the majority, or the Byzantine manuscripts, and as we'll see here in a moment, there's a reason for that. Vast majority of manuscripts produced after 1000 AD, all the way up to the time of the invention of printing in the 16th, well, middle of the 15th century, and then it becomes really popular at the beginning of the 16th century. Vast majority of those manuscripts are all from the same family, the Byzantine manuscripts, and they're represented by the Fraktur M. So it's not found in those manuscripts. But still, why did it happen? Well, ancient writers made the same error in regards to those endings. Here is the relevant portion of the Greek text as it would have appeared in the uncial or magisterial text in the early days of the New Testament. Now, what you need to understand, and I know many of you already know this, but it's always good to be refreshed. For the first 850, 900 years of the history of the Greek New Testament, it was written in what's called magisterial text, or uncial text. All capital letters, no spaces between words, and almost no punctuation. It's just one long line of capital letters. Imagine what that's like to read. It's not easy. Not easy. That wouldn't be easy in English, but and a lot of these scribes were copying a language they actually themselves did not know. So if you can imagine what it's like to be copying a language you don't read, how well are you necessarily going to do with it? But anyway, there's what it would have looked like, and I'll use color to show you where the variant arose. You can see tekna theou. Theou is what's called the nomina sacra. The nomina sacra is one of the sacred names. For reasons utterly unknown, there are all sorts of theories and speculations, but the fact of the matter is we just don't know. Christians, and only Christians, came up with this system of abbreviating sacred names. In fact, you can immediately identify a Christian manuscript by the presence of the nomina sacra. And what they did is they would take words like God, and there's a couple of different forms of nomina sacra. Normally it's 2 letters, sometimes it's 3 letters, depending on the manuscript. You put a line over top indicating it's been contracted. Why they did that, we don't know. But God, Lord, Jesus, Savior, Spirit, they were all contracted in the nomina sacra. We don't know why. But that's, if you know Greek, you know that that should be theta, epsilon, omicron, upsilon, theou. But it's only 2 letters because it's a nomina sacra. A children of God, kleithomen, we might be called kai esmen, and we are dia tuta hakasma, so on and so forth. So kleithomen and esmen both end with what look to you as men, mu epsilon nu. And so what obviously happened is a scribe writes down kleithomen, his eye goes back to what he's copying. Instead of seeing the mu epsilon nu at the end of kleithomen, he sees the mu epsilon nu at the end of esmen, continues from that point, and thereby inadvertently deletes chi esmen. He's not trying to deny that we're adopted as the children of God or anything like that. It's a simple error of sight. Unfortunately, an error of sight that I made more than once in typing my papers in high school in the beginning of college. And unfortunately, back then, once you discovered you did that, there wasn't much you could do about it. You just tore that piece of paper up and started all over again. That's how it worked. And you young folks need to respect us older folks that survived all that stuff because we tell you to. So there is an example of homoteleuton, and it happens a lot of times. And once you see it, because the other option is, well, if you take the idea that it wasn't there originally, that it wasn't there originally, why would someone add it? That would be a major theological insertion. It's much the simple way of dealing with this is the simplest answer is people make mistakes. The long, complicated answer is conspiracy theories. People who like conspiracy theories will go a different direction. But the simplest answer is homoteleuton. That's why there is a variant at this point. Now, as I said, the majority, the 5,700 plus Greek manuscripts date from after 1000 AD, comprising the majority text. The early texts are called papyri, written in unsealed majuscule text. They're called papyri because they're written on papyrus. They're written on papyrus. You take the leaves of the papyrus plant, you lay them at 90-degree angles to one another, you dry them. It produces a really smooth side on one side, but the back side's rather bumpy. And what's really weird, and again, nobody knows why this is, we have almost no Christian scrolls. We can count pretty much on one hand the number of Christian scrolls we have. All of the earliest papyri we possess, all of them, were written in codex form, the book form that we have today, written on both sides of the sheet. And that was not a popular way of writing until, in fact, some have even theorized that in the West, we know that the Chinese used it, but in the West, some have theorized that Christians introduced it. Why? Don't know. Could be that it was easier to carry that in a hidden form than scrolls. It's certainly a more effective way of utilizing your writing surface. We just don't know. We just don't know. But 99.9% of all Christian manuscripts are codex form. Even a little scrap I'll show you here a little bit later on. The earliest scrap, P2, it's written on both sides. That means you're writing on the rough side of the papyrus. It isn't always easy to do, which might explain some of the handwriting that you see on the rough side of the papyrus. But that's how it was written. Unsealed text, as I said, majuscule text, all capital forms, no spacing, almost no punctuation whatsoever. Now, I've already mentioned to you the New Testament textual families. We were having an interesting discussion last night at dinner, and it was mentioned to me that in some computer language form, we were talking about 70% versus the 30%. And what's interesting is, in essence, the manuscript families are based upon 70% agreement in a particular set of variants. Will identify those manuscripts as being the same family. And when you break down the overall manuscripts, you will notice that the vast majority are the Byzantine manuscript tradition. You have the Alexandrian. There are those who dispute the existence of the Caesarean. It's only been identified in certain portions of the Gospels, but there are still those who defend it to this day. It's an element of argumentation. And then you have the Western text, which is especially represented by the Latin texts and Latin Vulgate and things like that, which isn't about this, but there are Greek texts that agree with that Western text in readings. And that gives you sort of a graphical 3D image of percentage of numbers. Or this one's even more useful. What you have along the left-hand side here are the centuries, so 2nd century, 3rd, 4th, all the way up through the 16th century. You go, why would you go through the 16th century? If Gutenberg invents the press in the 1450s, then why would you go that far? Well, yes, Gutenberg did, but that doesn't mean that all of a sudden someone started cranking out. It's not like the iPad when it first came out. People were wondering whether anyone would ever use an iPad because it sounded so stupid. Well, they did, and so you had to manufacture lots of those things, and they have the ability of manufacturing things very, very quickly. People didn't have the ability to manufacture things very, very quickly back then, so it takes a long time to make presses, to train people, to cut the typesetting fonts, and just all sorts of stuff like that. And so hand copying continued to be an extremely important mechanism for the transmission of written texts for a long, long time, all the way into the 16th century. So what you have here in the blue are the papyri. They appear in the 2nd century and disappear pretty much by the 8th. You have what are called the uncials. So as we'll see after the peace of the church in AD 313, the church can start having nicer copies made, larger copies made upon parchment rather than upon papyrus. And so the unsealed texts, the great unsealed texts, are written during this period of time. And then some bright guy somewhere around here came up with the brilliant idea of, if we put spaces between words and we use capital letters and small letters and punctuation, it's so much easier. And you can see that pretty quickly people said, yeah, that is good. And so you have what are called the minuscule texts. And so they're written in the form of Greek that we would, if you've taken Greek in Bible college or seminary, that you would be familiar with reading. And you see that they pretty much wipe out the uncials immediately in the 10th century. But then looking at the numbers, you can see that the vast majority of these come from after the year 1000. There's a reason for this. Well, there's a couple reasons for this. One of the most obvious is if you're a papyrus manuscript written in the year 220, how long are you expected to exist? Well, how long do you expect any of the books we produce today to exist? Most of I've only had one hardback book. I'm a nobody, so I've only had one hardback book. So all the rest of my books have all been paperback. And I see some of those earliest paperback books today, and the pages are yellowing, the spine's getting brittle, not sure how long they're going to last. And so if you have a book made out of papyrus, how long do you expect it to last? The fact that we have manuscripts of the New Testament from that time period is amazing when you think about it. The fires and floods and the biggest enemy, aside from mankind bombing, Christians burning the library in Alexandria, it really helps a lot, and so human beings burning libraries and bombing buildings and stuff like that does in a lot of manuscripts. But the biggest destroyer of manuscripts, bugs, worms, maggots, just eat that thing up. That's just the way it is. And so simple age would explain why, as you get closer to the modern period where you actually start preserving these things and realizing their value and stuff like that, you've got a whole lot more manuscripts. But there's another really important reason for this, especially in regards to Greek manuscripts. And it requires you to know a little something about history. And this also impacts the readings of the New Testament as well. And that is, you have two major developments. The first is starting in about the 3rd century. The Western Church isn't doing a lot of reading of Greek anymore. They've switched over to Latin. Latin becomes the fundamental language theology in the West, and so there's much more of an emphasis upon the production of Latin manuscripts. But then something happens between 632 and 732. And 99% of Christians just don't put two and two together to realize what it was. But 632 should be a number that rings many bells in all of our minds anymore. There are certain, I'm teaching church history at church right now, and there are certain dates that I tell people, this will be on the final. You better remember this. One of them is the date of the Council of Nicaea, which was in 325. Notice my son was the first one out with that because he's heard this so many times. 632 would be another one that's always on the final. What's 632? Well, what's 632? Death of Muhammad. The death of Muhammad and the beginning of the century of Islamic expansion. Islam expands between 632 and 732, and then it stops expanding in 732 when their forces are turned back by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. So during that century, Islam spreads all across North Africa, which was a Christian area. Carthage, Hippo. Who was the great bishop of Hippo? Augustine. Augustine complained that at one point during his life, there was a great schism that existed in North Africa, in the churches in North Africa, versus what would be called the Catholic universal churches. Didn't mean Roman Catholic back then, but the Catholic churches versus the Donatist churches. And Augustine complained that at one point the Donatists had a convocation of their bishops, and there were 700 bishops in the Donatist church. So there were 700 Donatist churches represented there. That was a lot of them, pretty much all of North Africa. So North Africa, Egypt, Palestine, up around the Crescent into Asia Minor, Greece, Italy, Spain, France, North, all quote-unquote Christian lands. Now we could have, we can talk about church history, we can talk about the nature of Christianity in those places at that time, but that's where they were. So when Islam expands, all of North Africa, up into Spain and Portugal, all the way through the Holy Lands, out into Iraq, out toward west, toward Asia, and then moving up toward Constantinople. And in fact, that becomes the great place of conflict. Constantinople and the Greeks hold out until 1453, when the Seljuk Turks take Constantinople, and all those Greek scholars flee west, carrying their manuscripts with them, which became extremely important to both the Renaissance and the Reformation. Very, very important indeed. So, obviously, the rise of Islam is not overly good for the production of Greek manuscripts in the areas in which they are then taken over. And so this has a great impact because what most scholars believe is the most primitive form of the Greek New Testament, the Alexandrian text, was most popular in the very areas where Islam took over. And so this ends up impacting the number of manuscripts that are going to survive, being produced, so on and so forth. And so when we talk about the majority text, this is rather important. There are majority texts that have been published. There's two texts. You have the Hodges-Farstad majority text, which is basically, there are some differences, but basically based upon this methodology. If there are 400 manuscripts of 1 John, and 150 read one way, and 250 read the other, you go with the majority. So whatever has the greatest number of manuscripts, you go with that reading. It's not a matter of examining the reading, looking at the earliest manuscripts. Doesn't matter how early or late. It's majority rules. It's like a vote. And so when you create a text based upon that, it's going to be a very Byzantine text for the very obvious reasons that you see right here. The other is the Robinson-Pierpont, which is, again, a Byzantine text, slightly different methodology of determining the original readings. And Dr. Robinson is a wonderful guy, great to talk to. I don't agree with him on this issue, but he's a great guy and has some good things to say. One of my objections to the idea of using majority text theory is that the text would change depending on what century you're in. And I don't think that's a good thing. Because if you look at just the first, from 0 to through the 9th century, the first 1,000 years, the Alexandrian text predominates over the Byzantine. And so if you were to use that as your time frame, then you'd have an Alexandrian majority text. Now it's reversed because of history. Byzantium, i.e. Constantinople, Istanbul, held out and continued producing Greek manuscripts for another 700 years after the rise of Islam. And so they have the majority of the manuscripts. But all that means is the text that was popular in that area got reproduced more. That doesn't make it more representative of the original. That's hard for some people to figure out. They'd rather just go with the majority. It seems to be easier. But again, what's our fundamental desire? I want to know what John wrote, not what someone 1,000 years after John thought John should have written. Or I don't want to count noses if history explains why those noses end up having more noses than somebody else has. I want to know what most accurately represents the earliest text. And so that's something very important, very, very important to keep in mind. Okay? Now, what we're going to do for the rest of our time, and I'm going to let you go a little bit early because it's been a long day for many of you and it's late in the evening. One of the, you look at the bottom of the page in your Bible, and you'll have these vague statements like, the earliest and best manuscripts say such and such. Well, who gets to say that? There's obviously people that are going to dispute utilization of that language. Well, okay, maybe the earliest, but it's not the best, and so on and so forth. Very rarely do Christians get to look at the actual manuscripts themselves and to sort of make a connection, to see the reality of what lies behind the translation of the Bible that you possess to this day. And I think it's important to take a look at some of our earliest manuscripts. And so that's what we'll do. We'll start, we won't get too far this evening, but we'll start so you can be dreaming about New Testament manuscripts tonight as we're gently rocked to sleep as we go through the, I think it's pretty much staying in the inside passage now, don't we? So it's good, it should be nice and just a little bit of
No more Dramamine.
hopefully no more Dramamine, yes. Because New Testament manuscripts look really weird on Dramamine. I was being chased by P-52 with the orders of the ship. It was terrible. Here is P-52, Ryland's 457. That's just simply another numbering method. Some of you have heard the rumors, the premature rumors, of what's called the Green Project, of the discovery of some new manuscripts that have yet to be published. Dan Wallace sort of popped the news early in a debate with Bart Ehrman, and Greg Evans came out about a year, and I don't know, almost a year and a half ago now, and gave some more information, and it's about to be published, and still hasn't been, which has raised many, 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 many questions by many, many, many people. So allegedly, they have found in an Egyptian funerary mask a fragment of the Gospel of Mark that can be reliably dated to the 1st century, which means contemporaneous with the life at least of John the Apostle. Well, we don't know that yet because it hasn't been published and examined and dated and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And until that can be vetted and examined, that frequently takes many, many, many years. You just don't go with it. So up to this point, and continuing to this point, the majority of scholars would agree that if this isn't the earliest fragment of the New Testament, it's certainly one of the two or three that could possibly be the earliest fragment of the New Testament that we possess today. And you're looking at all of it. But it's written on both sides, actually. So it's about the size of a credit card. And what's fascinating about it is when it was discovered, and it was discovered in a cardboard box in a basement in London, because, of course, the Brits took a lot of stuff from Egypt when they colonized Egypt and dragged it back to the to British Isles, and it ended up in various universities and museums and things like that. And in the 1930s, people started working through all this stuff that had been discovered, and scholars started going, hey, that looks somewhat familiar. And the enterprising young scholar that, it's hard to read Greek like this. It's hard to read almost anything like this. Take a page from a book, tear out a little portion from the top that's only portions of sentences, and it's not easy to figure out what you're reading. But this guy is leafing through this box, and he starts reading this thing, and he goes, wait a minute, I've seen that someplace before. And the wonderfully fascinating thing about P2 that I think is so special is that if you want to be on the cutting edge of scholarship, if you want to be on the cutting edge of scholarship today, all you got to do is do this. I read Tom Wright. And that makes you cool. Some of you are going, who's he? Well, N.T. Wright, he doesn't want to be called N.T. for some obvious reason. He wants to be called Tom. Just call me Tom. And if you want to be considered really cool, you read Tom Wright. Well, back in the late 1800s in German scholarship, it had been decided the Gospel of John was not only the last one to be written, but it had to have been written around 175 AD. Couldn't have been written by John, and it wasn't written in the 1st century. Late 2nd century. And why? And that was a scholarly consensus. Scholars agreed. And why? Well, because it has such a high Christology, and it takes time for that to develop. And so that there had to have been decades that passed before such a high Christology could have possibly developed. This is an application of Darwinian evolutionary thinking to theology. And so, come 1933 or so, this little scrap of papyrus is found. I've often said I think God assigned one particular angel to this scrap of papyrus. Maybe the angel was assigned to the entire manuscript and just really did not do a very good job. That's a possibility too. Think about that, but maybe it was just to get anything through to the modern period, and this is what he managed to get through to us. And it, of course, is from the Gospel of John, chapter 18. On the front, verses 31 through 34, the back, verses 37 and 38, which just happens to be Jesus' dialogue with Pilate, where Pilate says, what is truth? I've always found that to be fascinating. And you can sort of see what it would have looked like. I have on my computer these days the very fonts that we used in the early papyri, and so that's how the text would have sort of wrapped around this particular little manuscript. When it was discovered, it was sent to the 4 leading papyrologists of the day, and papyrologists date manuscripts on the basis of the formation of letters, unless, of course, there's something, if it's found in the context that gives it a date, great, fine, wonderful, but the vast majority of stuff is not found in that way. This is found in the basement someplace. No one knows where it came from. No one knows who sold it to whom, where it came from, nothing like that. And so the dating is based upon, the form of the writing. And so it's a date range, generally a 50-year range. So you take a middle point, you go 25 years each direction, if you have enough really to be able to compare to other manuscripts and things like that to see how it compares. And when that was done, the decision on the part of 3 of the 4 was to date it at 125, so as early as 100 or as late as 150, and 1 put it in the 90s. And hence, P52 pretty much the best candidate for the earliest fragment of the New Testament we possess today. Now, those of you who know me know that I'm a geek, and so I took P52. You'll notice my tie that I'm wearing in my debate with Bart Ehrman. The tie is a fully readable version of P52, both sides. So you can actually read both sides of P52 on that tie. And there you see me giving a copy of that tie to Bart Ehrman, which is about the only time he smiled that entire evening, actually, in the process there. I don't know what he ever did with it. I don't know if he burned it. I don't know if he wears it, once a year just to mock fundamentalists or something. I have no earthly idea. But Mike will remember that I was displeased with his attitude enough that I had actually started to consider not giving him the tie. And Mike knew I had it with me, and so he sort of, said, got it. So I did. And so there's Bart Ehrman with his P52 tie. So anyway, we'll look at one more here, and then...
These museums don't do any code of dating of the 8 code of the poppers and stuff?
You mean as far as radioactive dating?
Yeah.
No. Generally, that requires destruction of the material itself. So you have to destroy it to be able to do that. And the papyrus is not necessarily the same age as the ink.
Yeah.
So you'd literally have to destroy part of the papyrus to come up with that kind of dating. It may be, but it's very rarely done. Very rarely done. As I mentioned, there are only 2. Now, by the way, if you have, on this subject, if you have any questions about what I'm about to tell you, after the conference is over, Brother O'Fallon has asked to be able to field all those questions. Okay, so don't ask me. It's in fact, he's hoping that some of you will want to spend the evening up on deck in the rain, talking about this particular papyrus, and he would like to do that till at least 2 o'clock. We only have 2 papyrus manuscripts of the Book of Revelation, and as you can see, it's not in the best shape. That would be what the remnants of a single page. So we can sort of tell by what's written there, by spacing, how big the letters are and stuff, sort of how to put it all together. And so you can see the majority of the page is missing. And this is P115. But what is interesting about P115 is that it does contain Revelation chapter 13. And in Revelation chapter 13 is a very interesting number. Specifically, the number of the beast. Now, everybody knows the number of the beast. I've often said, and talked about this in churches, that we could probably stop a biker gang going by outside and say, "What's the number of the beast?" And somebody would go, 666, and everybody knows the number of the beast, right? Well, the problem is there's the number of the beast, right? And in the 2 earliest papyri manuscripts of the Book of Revelation, it's not 666. It's 616. 616. Now, Dan Wallace is a textual scholar at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's the head of CSNTM, the Center for Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and knows a lot about this stuff. And I think he's pretty much figured it out. As he says, pretty obviously, 666 is the number of the beast, and 616 is the number of the neighbor of the beast. Go ahead, think that one through.
Takes a second to sink in.
It takes a little while for it to sink in. It's subtle humor, but it's sort of like I'm in cabin. I say that actually. Someone go running by at 3 o'clock in the morning named Ryan, knock on my door. But he probably wouldn't know anyways. But It's Mike would do that. Yeah. No, I don't think so. The address. Never mind. If you didn't get it, it's okay. But as I said, the significance of this is very, very large for people like Brother Hagee, and so who may not be aware of this, but if he was, it would lead to an entire whole new series of books about blood moons. It would be different dates because the numbers have all changed or something like that. But anyway, the significance of the number of the beast I will leave completely to Brother O'Fallon to expound to you, and we won't even bother to go there.
Hillary Clinton's birthday is June 6th.
June 16th. June 16th, yeah. Right. Actually, we have no earthly idea what that is. But anyway. So, we will pick up with that in the morning. No, wait a minute. When do we meet again?
Tomorrow morning at 8:30.
8:30.